pretty much always going to be involved in this and only not going to be a relevant factor if the shootings ended before they got there. And so that's a good sign. And so a lot of the focus on that end of things should focus on improving response time, making sure that schools are working with local law enforcement to really make sure that the response is going to be smooth. They know where they're going, they know how to get into buildings, they know how to get in the doors, they know where the keys are. For example, in one of the shootings, I believe it was Robb Elementary School. It took about, I believe, 8 hours for law enforcement to fully access the room because they were unfamiliar, they were uncoordinated, they were standing by, waiting to enter for several hours, trying to get breaching tools, trying to get keys together to enter the room. They were trying to test the keys on a nearby room to unlock it. I think it turned out the door eventually was actually unlocked during the whole time, and then they actually went. It was a mess. There was no communication there, but stuff like that, smoothing that out with the training with the school, can be a really big factor because armed ended things 4 out of 5 times. Physical confrontation was also significantly successful, which is another really good sign because that's the most accessible of the things. You don't need someone who's armed, you don't need to wait for law enforcement to respond. Anyone who's interested can get involved and maybe make that difference because there was an 81%. And so it's very easy, or not easy, but if you choose to physically confront the shooter, there's a very high chance that you succeed. Though it is important to note that there was no analysis of outcomes for those who responded and confronted the shooter. And so in some cases, both an armed, physical, and verbal, some who were successful were injured or killed, some who were unsuccessful survived and were fine, and then there were, of course, those who were unsuccessful, killed, successful, and were fine. What was very interesting was verbal confrontation was not significantly different, so it means about a 50-50 chance, which is not great. In fact, this is the only confrontation modality that had a higher failure rate than success rate at 6 that were successful, 7 that were unsuccessful. And so I would highly recommend avoiding that one in favor of physical or armed, though it should be noted, it wasn't significantly ineffective. And so depending on the case, your relationship with that shooter, which could be a factor in how effective that is, as well as what point in the shooting it is. As we kind of saw with that high casualty level, there were none there, and so it may be more easy to successfully verbally confront a shooter at that beginning stages. I know in one shooting there was a student who went to the bathroom where the shooter was getting prepped. The student was shot, and then that student was able to successfully talk down the shooter. And so a lot of cases like that, the big leverage point is no one's died yet, it's still early, and that's among the most common methods used in the verbal confrontation. And so if that's not exactly applicable anymore, then it could be a challenge. And then modality and success were independent and unrelated, probably because the armed and physical effectiveness was pretty much equal, both right around that 80% mark. And then verbal wasn't terribly far off or enough to be significant. It was 50-50 versus 80%. And then the distribution at the high level was very interesting because pretty much half of it was armed, but then the other half was pretty much nothing. And so you either saw law enforcement get involved and stop it, or the shooter decided they were done then and leave. I know in the Parkland shooting, the shooter went about all their shooting, and then they left and got a drink at Subway, and then were later apprehended by law enforcement. And so stuff like that is, we need to make sure, not that we don't have the same obligation in lower casualty incidents, but if it's the law enforcement's understanding that it's a more impactful shooting, there's more casualties, then they really need to make sure that they're getting in and stopping it. Because otherwise it's the shooter's discretion how bad it gets, which is never where we want to leave it. And so at those higher levels, it may take more force to stop, as we kind of covered with the verbal and not being as effective anymore. And then the shooter may have also put more preparation into making sure they know how to use their weapon, are able to keep it functioning, which was a significant factor for in some of those incidents where the shooter's gun jams and then people are able to step in and stop them. And so a more experienced shooter may not have those same level of vulnerability. And so it requires that law enforcement approach. And they may also have more limited options to kind of get involved because of those factors. Some of the limitations, as this study didn't look at the variation within modalities, so like with the armed case, there was, though pretty much all of armed confrontation did occur by law enforcement with actual firearms, there was other means used, like that pencil, which was unfortunately ineffective. The shooters went bulletproof vest. The student essentially stabbed the pencil into the vest and like got it stuck in there, and they were unfortunately killed. So that kind of variation, as well as the relationship between the shooter and the person trying to talk him down, how that goes about, and then in the physical realm, what techniques are used, how close they were, how many people, how well versed in, like, are they on a wrestling team, are they a football player, or are they someone who does not have that experience at all, and so may not be as well versed in that attempt. And then also the quality and type of police response, which I've gone over in some detail. You all need the Rod Elementary School one, where it is a pretty poorly run response. And then there's also the difference between SWAT officers, standard patrol officers, SROs. A great deal of the armed confrontation here happened from SROs. Many got immediately as involved as they could, running to where the shooter was. Though in cases like Parkland, there were SROs who were not involved. And then I know in the report following the Sandy Hook shooting, it was recommended that all patrol officers are trained and have equipment to respond, such as bulletproof vests, long rifles in their standard cars, where they are always ready to respond to this type of incident, should it arise, which could be an effective way to cut down on that response time. You aren't waiting on the SWAT team to mobilize and show up. And then offender characteristics, where not all offenders are created equal, though in this study it's not a factor that was examined. And so their motivations could impact susceptibility to being talked down, how many, and several, there were multiple offenders. Sometimes they use that number to their advantage, splitting up to cover more ground. In other cases, it stayed together. And then what weapons were used, magazine capacity, familiarity with the weapon, all kind of play a role. If they have a backup weapon, they may be able to switch that if they run into a malfunction with the primary weapon. Other times it's they have one and it jams up and that's it. They get tackled by like 6 people. And so those would all be factors that could impact the effectiveness of different responses. And then similar challenges as last time with the data availability and quality. There's still no main database, so I heavily relied on the incidents I examined in the last study. There were few sources of information. A lot of them have been tabled off since I last took. Many are 20, 30 years old, going back to the day of the shooting. And there's 2 articles in one local newspaper written by the same person, like 2 days apart. And that's all the information we're working with. And so a lot better documentation needs to get put in place when it comes to these incidents to really get a better idea. And then some areas for further research that could be very productive are the outcome for those who confront shooters is probably the most pressing, because we saw armed and physical are almost identical in effectiveness. If one's significantly better outcomes for those who get involved, then that's important information to decide which necessarily pushing more for it. And then also impact of response time on casualties. Other than the casualty level, there was no real assessment of those casualties in this, because response time would likely be a greater factor. For example, in that one where it went on for hours, that's going to have a much different outcome than one that went on for 30 seconds. Even though they both might have been ended successfully by confrontation, the casualty levels, you can't really compare them on the grounds of how they were ended. And then number of casualties between incidents ended by confrontation. So incidents ended by confrontation, compare that to those that were not, would be a really good area to look at to see if it does make a difference in how many people are hurt, and whether or not we should really try and get that response time down, or if, which I'm guessing that's going to be a pretty significant difference based on what I saw here, but the research just hasn't been done yet. And then also break down those modalities a little bit more to examine how those types of variation really play out. I chose to keep this study more limited to the strict modalities, as last time I bit off way more than I could chew, spread the data way too thin, and did everything I could to avoid that issue again and get strongly significant findings versus 30 findings that mean nothing. And then also the number of confrontations by severity, because just reading through some of the reports on the larger shootings, it seemed like there was very little confrontation over the course of the event, where most of the time they're just allowed to move through the school unconfronted, versus those that you see the person stand up, fire off a couple shots, and then get tackled or end the shooting some other way. And so, wrapping things up, school shootings are still a problem, and there's still very little information on how they ended. The present study built upon that previous study I did to examine how confrontation ends it, because it's often more of a factor than those protective measures that are employed. And then used a much more compact design here to really get into the effectiveness of each, versus trying to spread it out, understand more, but not having the data to support those findings. Both armed and physical are about equally effective, but verbal's pretty close to 50-50. Further study of confrontation outcomes and those related areas are probably really good next avenues for anyone interested in getting into this field or building on research here. And then there should also be an examination of that effect of confrontation-centric responses versus the run-hide-fight model, where it's all the way at the end, and see how that exactly, and while I'm not recommending it now, is there going to be more casualties if the first stance is to confront the shooter and stop the shooting for everyone, or is it have potential victims like students that get out of the area, hide, and only fight as a last resort while we're trying to get that law enforcement model, and how do those dynamics really affect it all? And then improved record keeping and data collection is huge. Continuing to, it's very hard to do research when you have no information to work with, as I found out through these last two studies. And then also just one more thing is that while this study, armed confrontation was effective, and so going back to that armed teachers issue of this study in no way supports or proves that that's an effective way, but since armed confrontation is a successful way of ending things, it opens the door to have that conversation about the other factors there, because there is going to be an increased risk of all firearm related incidents in that school, accidents. There's requirements on effective training, on who can carry, all of that still needs to be considered. But this opens the door to having a conversation, versus if it was like armed confrontation doesn't work, and then it wouldn't be worth that. Here are my references, and does anyone have any questions?